Today, we're diving in to one of the darkest chapters in European history, the witch trials. But we're not just going to talk about the hysteria. We're going to explore something even more fascinating, how the legal system itself started to use reason and logic to dismantle the very panic it had once helped create. So let's get into it. First, you really have to wrap your head around the scale of this. 40,000. That's the estimated number of people, mostly women, executed for witchcraft in Europe between the 15th and 18th centuries. Some historians even think about 100,000 people were put on trial. This wasn't just some fringe belief, it was a full-blown crisis, fueled by fear and superstition. So here's our game plan. We'll start with the big picture of the hysteria, then we'll see how simple everyday fights spiraled into deadly accusations. After that, we're going to look at two really important court cases that show things were starting to change. And finally, we'll see how rationality started to win the day in the courtroom. For literally centuries, Europe was caught in this massive moral panic. With around 100,000 trials, the idea of evil witches wasn't some campfire story. It was a mainstream terror with absolutely devastating consequences for tens of thousands of real people. But here's the thought. What if the spark that lit these fires wasn't really about a pact with the devil? What if, a lot of the time, it all started with something much more ordinary, like a fight over a stolen pig or an unpaid debt? And that brings us to a really key idea from the source material. The witchcraft charge, it was often the last desperate move in some long-running local feud. It was basically a way to use the superstition of the times as a weapon against a neighbor you already couldn't stand. The pattern usually went something like this. So first, it starts with a typical neighborly dispute, right? Maybe about property lines or livestock or just someone's reputation. Then it ramps up. You get accusations of normal crimes, like theft. But when that doesn't work, that's when they pull out the nuclear option, the witchcraft accusation. And just like that, the full power of the church and state could come crashing down on you. It sounds pretty unstoppable, doesn't it? But here's the thing, it wasn't. Little pockets of reason started popping up inside the justice system itself. So how on earth did judges start to see through all the smoke and mirrors? Well, let's take a look at our first case. We're heading back to England in 1577. This is way before the panic really hit its peak in a lot of places. And here, in the case of a woman named Margaret Cotte, we find this incredible early example of a court just not buying it. Margaret Cotte was accused of witchcraft by her neighbor. I mean, it was the classic setup, probably started over some personal spat. But when the case got to the local court, something pretty amazing happened. The judges actually looked at the claims and found zero proof. None. So they acquitted her. Now, what the court did here was so important. They didn't just say, not guilty. They basically called it what it was, a malicious attempt to ruin someone's name. They saw that this wasn't a supernatural crime. It was a normal human dispute in disguise. And that's a huge shift from judging superstition to analyzing people's motives. Okay, let's jump forward over a century. That skepticism we just saw, it hits this incredible peak in what became one of England's last big witch trials. The case of Jane Wenham in 1712 is just a masterclass in how one rational judge could stand firm against a wave of absolute hysteria. The accusations against Jane followed that same old pattern. It all kicked off with an argument with a local farmer, but the evidence they brought to court was just a bizarre mix of neighborhood gossip, wild claims about demonic cats, and even failed religious tests. This table really shows you the showdown between superstition and reason. Look, it starts as a business dispute. The judge, Sir John Powell, his response is totally logical. Sue him for slander. He treats it like a normal civil case. Then you get the claim about flying cats, which the judge just openly mocks. And finally, when Jane can't recite a prayer perfectly, a common superstitious test, the judge basically says, that stuff has no place in my courtroom. And this is the line that became famous. When a witness testified about seeing Jane flying, Judge Powell just dryly replied that, well, there's no law against flying. He was using pure sarcasm to show just how ridiculous the whole thing was. And here's the kicker. The jury, totally caught up in the local panic, actually found Jane Wenham guilty. They sentenced her to death. But Judge Powell refused to let that happen. He stepped in, put the execution on hold, and went straight to Queen Anne to get a royal pardon. And he got it. His rational mind directly overrode the jury's fear and literally saved her life. Now, these cases, Margaret Coate's and Jane Wenham's, they weren't just random, isolated events. They were signposts marking a much bigger shift that was happening all across the continent. The legal system was slowly but surely evolving, moving away from just rubber-stamping public panic and toward a system based on facts. I mean, the contrast is night and day, right? The old system let personal grudges and mass hysteria become a death sentence. But this new, emerging system started demanding something different, actual, tangible proof. It started making a distinction between what people believed and what could actually be proven. So, what's the big takeaway here? Well, you had skeptical judges who started questioning these supernatural claims. Court procedures began to focus on real evidence. And, maybe most importantly, the law started to become a shield to protect people from mass hysteria instead of a weapon to be used by it. This whole process wasn't just about ending the witch trials, it was a fundamental step in building the modern legal systems we have today. And that leaves us with one last question to chew on. The story of the witch trials really shows how powerful a rational legal system can be in protecting us from our own worst impulses. But when you look around at the world today, you have to wonder, is the law still our best and strongest defense against the modern kinds of social hysteria? Definitely something to think about.